Jesus represents in a superior way. Jesus teaches in a superior way, with authority beyond those of the career teachers, the professors, the faculty. And Jesus brings holiness in a whole new way. Let's look at how that works. I'm going to give you a one-line description of Jesus' mission as priest. It's to offer the resources that will reconcile God and God's people. Hebrews 9:14, through the eternal Spirit, he offered himself without blemish to God. And that's what you're going to see unfold over Jesus' career. And my hope here is that after this series, you can read the Gospels better. You can read them in a more insightful way because you'll recognize what's going on. If we start at Jesus' baptism, his baptism declares his sonship. Right? You are my son. And Hebrews 5 takes Jesus' sonship as a sign of his priesthood, as well as his royalty. You become a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Immediately after his baptism, the Spirit who's just descended on him leads him into the wilderness. Or in Mark, the Spirit drives him into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. The devil took him to Jerusalem and set him on the pinnacle of the temple. Gosh, do you think that's a coincidence that he puts him on the temple? And he said to him, if you're the Son of God, prove it. Throw yourself down from here. All right? Jump. Come on. Don't you have enough faith? So the devil quotes him a little bit of Psalm 91 and says, well, it says God takes care of God's anointed, so what do you say? Prove it. If you're the Son of God. And Jesus responds the way he responds to all three temptations. He quotes the Torah. Specifically, he quotes Deuteronomy. This matters. Deuteronomy is Moses' set of instructions on how to succeed being Israel, how not to fail. And they fail. And now Jesus is in the wilderness, and he's not going to fail. And so he's paid attention, and when the devil gives him this offer to prove his, to prove that God is with him, he answers back from Deuteronomy 6:16. It is written, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. But if you're in Luke's audience or Matthew's audience and you've heard the temptations, you've heard Jesus quoting Deuteronomy, if you're in his original audiences, you know the Old Testament pretty well. You know Deuteronomy pretty well. You probably hear it every year in the synagogue. You know that's only the first half of the line. Deuteronomy 6:16 and following. Do not tempt the Lord your God as you did at Massah. Oh, now you're like, oh, Massah. Well, no, you're not, right? Because we're illiterate. We'll look that up. Well, let's look it up now because the audience would have understood Massah. Exodus 17. From the wilderness, the whole Israelite community continued by stages as the Lord would command, and they encamped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. The people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us up from Egypt? Was it to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst? That's a constructive attitude. You ever been backpacking or camping with someone like that? They're really fun to have along. Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, what shall I do with this people? Before long, they'll be stoning me. And then the Lord said to Moses, pass before the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take along the rod with which you struck the Nile, and set out. And I will be standing there before you on the rock at Horeb. strike the rock, and water will issue from it. And the place was named Massa and Meribah. Massa means trial, and Meribah means quarrel, because the Israelites quarreled because they put the Lord to the test, saying, is the Lord present among us or not? Now that's the punchline of Exodus, of that story. Is the Lord among us or not? And when they were in a place without the resources they wanted, they assumed he wasn't. Jesus says, I don't need to ask whether God is with us or not. I mean, he's Emmanuel. He is God with us. The offer here from the devil is the same offer that you're going to hear from later opponents all through Jesus' career. In fact, that's the case with all three temptations. The offer here is going to be, prove it so that we'll believe you. Do something outrageous so that we'll know that God is with you. Give us a sign. And Jesus knows that the heart that asks that question isn't going to go for the sign anyway. It's not like the devil's going to be convinced. The devil knows who Jesus is. So when Jesus is given the offer to show a sign, he says, a wicked and perverse generation asks for a sign, and no sign will be given it, except for one, the sign of Jonah. Jonah was 3 days in the earth and then out. The Son of Man will be 3 days in the earth and then out. That'll be your sign. All right? What you get here are two different visions of priesthood. One trusts in God, represents God accordingly. The other doubts and gambles and careens between insecurity and arrogance. Neither of those is priesthood. And so Jesus refuses the offer. Okay? Go and look it up when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament. It's so much more fun. And it's so much fun to discover for yourself and make a connection that was made among the original audiences, but it's widely missed. Jesus leaves the wilderness, goes back to the promised land, the way Joshua led Israel into the promised land. Jesus is the Greek form of the word Joshua. Joshua is his namesake. And look at what he does in his ministry in the land. He teaches. In fact, he gives interpretations of the Torah that are better than the priests, better than the scribes that also work in the temple. The woman with a 12-year-long hemorrhage just touches his robe and she's healed. He encounters 10 lepers and says, go, show yourself to the priests after you wash. And on their way to the priests, they're healed. One kind of priest can only certify that you're well. The other kind of priest makes you well, does the cleansing. So all of these times, he's not just a priest. He's not just an awesome priest. He's a priest with a twist. In every one of these roles, he's a priest with a new twist. He casts out demons, unclean spirits. Okay? Unclean spirits. And the granddaddy of them all, which we already talked about, he forgives sins. Now the priests can do the sacrificing that's associated with the forgiveness of sins, but Jesus does it apart from those sacrifices. Priesthood with a twist. Priests spend their time conserving and protecting Israel's holiness. That's holiness on the defensive. But Jesus is practicing holiness on the offensive. When a priest touches a leper, what happens? Well, the priest is rendered unclean, right? But when Jesus touches the leper, instead of Jesus becoming compromised, the leper's healed. The woman is healed. The demon-possessed person is delivered. The dead body is raised. The little girl gets up. Instead of protecting the temple and keeping it from the unclean, it's as if he is the temple. And he's represented that way in the Gospel of John. Destroy this temple and I'll raise it in 3 days. And they think, that took 46 years to restore. You're going to do that in 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So John understands Jesus not just to be a priest of the temple, he is the temple. He is the Holy of Holies. And he brings its holiness wherever he goes on a campaign to restore Israel. And for those who don't see it and can't believe it, the authorities of Jesus' people, it's a scandal. They declare him a sinner, a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. That's Deuteronomy language for what you would do with a disobedient son. You would make that proclamation and then you would take him out and, if the elders agree, cut him off. And so the Jewish authorities conclude that Jesus is not a representative of his people. He's to be cut off. And they do so. They hand him over to die an unclean, reprehensible death, which just happens to be the act, the sacrifice that accomplishes the restoration. And so the cross is the cross of a priest.